All right. Well, I guess we can get started. And Kate, if you see any people in the waiting room, you can help me out with that. Meanwhile, uh, thanks for joining us here at the Drawn Out Conference. This is our second to last talk of the conference. Like, what is a conference? You might be asking if you're new here. The Drawn Out Conference is a group of early career art faculty who have come together to talk about how drawing sort of re-energizes their art practice. And these early career art faculty are sort of based around the Ohio region, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania, even someone from Puerto Rico, which is not exactly Ohio region, but it did end up going there at first. Um, and these artists are different disciplines, painters, sculptors, drawers, I don't know, different disciplines of art making. So each how we use drawing in different ways. This iteration, the Drawn Out Conference, it is a series of Zoom talks, and it is also a traveling exhibit that's going to each of the participants' institution, their home institution. And so let me introduce Kate Hampel, who is with us today. Kate holds an MFA in Fiber and Material Studies from the School of Art Institute of Chicago, a BFA from Concordia University in Montreal. Her work has been shown at many museums, galleries, art fairs throughout the United States, Canada, and Asia. Has participated in residency programs as well throughout the United States. As a recipient of the Illinois Arts Council Individual Artist Grant and Virginia Commonwealth University Fountainhead Fellowship in Craft Material Studies. Currently lives in Bishopville, Ohio, is a co-founder of Folly, an artist residency for artists, writers, and scholars, and teaches at Ohio University School of Art and Design. Kate, thank you so much for being here, contributing to the Drawn Out Conference. I look forward to your talk, and I'm going to hand the keys over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here, and those who are still showing up a couple minutes late, we'll let you in, I think. So let me see, I have to share my screen. All right, so hopefully everyone is seeing that. So as Keith explained, this talk is part of the Drawn Out Conference, which is not only Zoom artist talks, it is also this traveling exhibition, which I know many of you in the audience have contributed work to and seen already. I think I sent my work out to the first iteration maybe a year ago. So it has been really nice in the last couple of weeks to get all that work back and like see all of your work in real life, even as I'm preparing for this sort of hybrid virtual talk. To have these different elements has been really great. It has been, I realized, like literally years since I've hung an exhibition. So that was a fantastic experience, and it's all I want to do right now. We also got to have an opening on Wednesday of this week, which was really exciting, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So again, thank you to my fellow artists for sharing their work and to Keith for coordinating this whole project. So first, I'm going to share some images of the work so it can say hello to you all. And since this is really what brought us all here, it is, I think for all of the artists in this exhibition, it's been a means of working through the difficulties of maintaining a creative practice, whether through a pandemic, as obviously it has been, or just through life, because that has been happening at the same time. So here it is. This is the exhibition as it is right now, and as it will be for the next couple of weeks. This is not a traditional gallery space, obviously. This is actually my office suite in Siegfried Hall, which is where the School of Art and Design lives at Ohio University. My colleagues and I have held some exhibitions here before, and it has been really interesting to see how we can engage this narrow hallway space. And I feel like this group of pieces actually worked really well. It sort of benefits from close looking. You can get up right beside the pieces, and there's like just the right amount of work in this space. So on the left here, we have Emmeline Solomon and Lisa Walcott. This is Justin's work on the top, and then Edward Victor Sanchez on the right. and Heather Brand's work. And then this is my work and also my daughter, Maura Kelly's work. So we collaborated on the project in this exhibition. And the project for me is really an exploratory research project that was both instigated by and also really addressed for me the conditions of 2020 and 2021, which of course brought a multitude of challenges. Some of those were really widely felt, and some of them were very personal and different for everyone. So this project grew out of those more personal, particular challenges. And it did, in fact, help me break through a creative rut, just as the title of our conference explains. This talk is called Coming to Terms, and it will unspool over 3 parts. There will be poetry, there will be children, as there are in life. So the first part is a story. It's a true story about vultures. The second part is the story of coming to terms with changed circumstance and finding a practice when and where you can. And finally, there's the story of an art opening, which is also a story of coming to terms with life and with time and with different kinds of engagement. So here's the first story. I moved to Southeast Ohio in 2018 into a house that sits on some land in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. There are a lot of trees around and a lake, and the soil is made of clay. In the first fall that I lived here, there was a magical evening in October when a huge swarm of vultures flew in. And at the time, I knew enough to know that they were vultures, but I didn't really know much else about them. They moved into trees near my house, and they stayed for most of the winter. And I can look back on this now and see my own hubris here, that I was the one who had just arrived, and I was like commenting and noticing their arrival, but for them, this is their regular winter home. But really, you know, who wants a huge flock of vultures roosting right around their house? The symbolism felt a bit heavy-handed. So the vultures come and go. It turns out they live here mostly during fall and spring. If it doesn't get too cold, they'll stay all winter, but often we lose them in January and February for a bit, when I guess they go a little further south if it snows. So a couple of years go by, a pandemic starts and continues in which I am pregnant, and so considered particularly vulnerable. And I just say this to sort of set the stage for what's to come. As the fall of 2020 rolls around, I have a small child at home who hasn't had any outside childcare for months. And then finally, at the end of September, a newborn as well. And we would all be home together every day for many months after that. When the vultures arrived that fall, there were more than there had ever been before. And I've since learned that black vultures, which is what these are, and turkey vultures are some of the few bird species, and in fact, some of the few animal species in general, that have been thriving in recent years, despite constant human contact and expansion. So later, this would start to be a hopeful fact to think about, but that fall, I definitely felt it differently. They were roosting on the tree in my front yard, where it had always before been just in the woods. They were on the roof of my garage, one morning on the roof of my house. And I would shout at them, and at first they flapped off, but eventually they just would look at me. I didn't matter, and I was definitely not frightening. My daughter, we'll stay here. My daughter was 2 years old and asked me why I didn't like the vultures, which was a reasonable question when I think about it, because usually we would look out sort of eagerly together for the deer or the rabbits, the woodpeckers, the occasional fox. And I pointed out to her without prejudice when a hawk is carrying a mouse to eat. So why wasn't I excited about these neighbors? I had to sort of ask myself as well. And explaining my discomfort to her required breaking it down in a way that I hadn't really, until that point, named for myself. So I don't like vultures because they eat dead things. True, but so do many other animals who even kill things before they eat them. But I don't want them eating dead things right around our house because it might smell bad, because it might make a mess. And really because when you see them, it makes you think that something has died. And then it reminds me that everything dies, and not just dies, but rots, and that I will die and not just die, but rot. And that's the underlying trouble that was staying with me. Donna Haraway writes about staying with the trouble in her 2016 book of that name. And she says, the task is to make kin in lines of inventive connection as a practice of learning to live and die well with each other in a thick present. Our task is to make trouble, to stir up potent response to devastating events, as well as to settle troubled waters and rebuild quiet places. In urgent times, many of us are tempted to address trouble in terms of making an imagined future safe, of stopping something from happening that looms in the future, of clearing away the present and the past in order to make futures for coming generations. Staying with the trouble does not require such a relationship to times called the future. In fact, staying with the trouble requires learning to be truly present, not as a vanishing pivot between awful or Edenic pasts and apocalyptic or salvific futures, but as mortal critters, entwined in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, meanings. So I decided to start drawing the vultures every day. My practice has always investigated those things that trouble me, abuses of power, for instance, sometimes the macabre. My discomfort in this case was really quite anthropocentric, but by staying with it and not necessarily trying to fix it, I could find hopefully a more interesting and productive way to engage. And that brings us to the first intermission, which is The Moment by Margaret Atwood. The moment when, after many years of hard work and a long voyage, you stand in the center of your room, house, half acre, square mile, island, country, knowing at last how you got there and say, I own this, is the same moment the trees unloose their soft arms from around you, the birds take back their language, the cliffs fissure and collapse, the air moves back from you like a wave and you can't breathe. No, they whisper, you own nothing. You were a visitor time after time, climbing the hill, planting the flag, proclaiming, we never belonged to you. You never found us. It was always the other way around. So on to the second story. Drawing to come to terms. Drawing is paying attention in its own particular way. And artists know this already. Science is just beginning to understand. In a study called The Surprisingly Powerful Influence of Drawing on Memory, researchers at the University of Waterloo found that drawing as a study tool is more effective than reading or writing alone, and it doesn't matter if you draw it well. The study authors propose that this works because drawing integrates various modes of thinking between language, fine motor skills, and pictorial skills. But I think also as artists, there's another way to think about it that avoids language and translation altogether, and it lives really just in the realm of visuality and materiality. And writing in the journal Studies in Material Thinking, another couple of authors, Marit Mäkelä, Nithikul Nimkulrat, and Tero Heikkinen, write that drawing is both an active and subjective engagement, valued by artistic researchers, not only for what may finally be encrypted in the drawing, but more significantly for the access provided through drawing to thinking that is close to the unconscious. And this is where I think, we as artists maybe don't do all those translations that the researchers might be thinking about, that drawing just is for us already. With that said, I have actually never been much of a drawer. My practice is sculptural and fiber-based, and I came to it more from an interest in making by hand rather than an interest in the pictorial or in drawing per se. My work needs time and space. It's never been quicker in the moment. I'm generally interested in considering how aesthetics shape our response to power and to violence. And as a sort of belated introduction to myself after all this, I'm going to show you a few older works here to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. And it's a fairly long way from drawing animals with children. So this piece is called Neither Cruel Nor Unusual. And it's a sort of visual meditation on the spectacle of the American criminal justice system, particularly capital punishment, which for most of human history has been a very public, very graphic event that I would argue is a form of state-sponsored terrorism. And this piece takes some of the visual cues of that system, particularly related to the reopening of the firing squad chamber in the state of Utah, and it kind of mashes them up and spits them back out again. I suppose to ask, is this what we want? Is this exciting? Is this what revenge looks like, and does it feel good? This piece is called Desperate Measures, and it's more open-ended perhaps, but comes out of my thinking of another side of the same story. So I was thinking about true crime podcasts, which are maybe the new version of Law and Order Special Victims Unit, except that SVU is still very much around. And thinking at the same time about how strange it is that I would listen to these, that I would enjoy them, which I absolutely do, and what it is that's so appealing about stories of violence, and particularly brutal violence, almost always enacted on the bodies of young women. Something that I've been working with for a while, which shows up in a lot of my work, is this high resolution digital print of my own skin on a stretch fabric, sometimes cotton, as in this case, sometimes spandex. And it's then sewn into these distorted forms. So it no longer really references any specific body part, but you still get freckles and wrinkles. You get this sort of goose flesh texture and the weight of flesh. And this will be the last throwback. It's called Desert Scenes, Indiana. And I made this work in Indiana and also in Chicago during the period when ISIS, the terrorist group, was most active in Iraq and Syria. So this is 2014 and 2015. You may recall they were very actively engaged in taking hostages, mostly Muslims from the region, but also some foreign journalists and aid workers, and then beheading those hostages on camera and publishing the videos online. And they had a fairly slick media production team, which was a far cry from Al-Qaeda's first iteration of this kind of video. That was a VHS tape mailed to a Boston newspaper in the 90s. So their production team was really mimicking most online production and news production, and felt very of the moment. So this series takes those videos and looks at them for what had essentially become genre conventions. There's a figure in orange and a figure in black set against a backdrop of sand and sky, and that is repeated in each one. And for me, I think the most poignant horror about these murders recorded on video is that they were done for video, for the consumption of an audience, using tropes that someone in America or in the West would recognize. The orange uniforms on the prisoners, for example, are pulled directly from images of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. So its fear and humiliation really reflected back at an American audience. And these pieces are recreations of those elements, citing them in the Midwest with the Indiana dunes for a backdrop, and fragments of architecture from the crumbling brickwork that I would walk by in Chicago. And those bricks are wrapped in prison uniforms from Illinois correctional institutions. So with most of this work, I would usually spend a long time really deep diving into a topic, reading and writing, making miniatures. But in 2020 and the ensuing years, the idea of having extensive quiet time to focus, followed by extensive studio time to make large-scale sculptures, wasn't just impossible, it was laughable. So if you've ever had a small child or an infant, you might understand that. And what was possible at the time was drawing. I found myself sitting down to draw pretty much every day with my daughter, swirls and colors, and eventually the beginnings of faces and people. And at the same time, I had also been trying to relocate for myself some kind of daily practice ritual. And so the watching and the drawing became the research. So I started drawing the vultures every day, and you'll see that's coincidentally on Friday the 13th of November. And my daughter Maura wanted to join me. At first, I was a bit resistant to this. It felt very important at the time that it was mine. But the more I thought about it, it really made no sense. So we started to draw together one page each day. And I had to teach myself not to be precious about this, to just let it happen as it would. And I want to show you the cover of our vulture book just to highlight that. This was the only empty sketchbook that I had. And at first I was certain that I was going to cover it in some kind of fabric because it felt ridiculous to draw vultures and think about mortality in this floral notebook. But this too, I realized eventually just didn't matter. And the point was to stay with it. So I started to notice things like how the longest feathers on the ends of the vulture's wings resemble fingers, and how the birds have a daily schedule that mirrors my own pretty precisely. Up for breakfast at 7, home by 6 in the evening. I saw them warming their wings in the sun, and a young one learning to fly, and sometimes I would write myself notes as well as drawing. I also started to notice things about us, that sometimes we would draw in the same way, and sometimes we would focus on totally different aspects of what we were seeing. Also that Maura would happily fill a whole notebook in a week and not stick to one page a day. And I think one of the best moments of this whole experience was when I found her with the notebook, drawing vultures by herself. This is her page. And she was actually quite worried when I saw her that she would be in trouble. But I was very pleased. So these are some of our ongoing works over the course of that year. And I do think sometimes she would sort of echo what I was doing. And here she's added to my page after I've done mine. And there was reading too, of course. I could keep geeking out about vultures for a while longer. But I think it isn't really about them. Is it? what does it lead to? I'm asking myself. So I'm thinking about ecosystems and about scavenging and about staying with the trouble. And so these are some of the larger works that have grown out of this practice, also through the pandemic. This piece was installed on the front porch of my house as part of Art in Place, which was an international at-home exhibition, which included online directions. So you could follow a walking tour in Chicago, but also find pieces all over the world. The hanging objects, some of them have a real familiarity and some are quite mysterious to me. It's a toy gun on the left. There is a painted concrete Dalmatian's head, a ladle, a brick, and some various spools of metal that I don't quite understand. They've all been pulled out of the woods behind my house where they had been discarded and buried. I don't know for how long. And I've been thinking about myself in this place as well. So the ropes that they're hanging from are all ropes that I've made and dyed with the walnuts that also grow in the woods. This piece was a collaboration with my partner, who's also an artist, and it was also made and installed at home. This is a reinterpretation of the old wrought iron fence that you can see a little bit in the previous picture, hung with homemade oil lamps that were lit each night over the period of a few weeks. And our house gets a fair amount of drive-by traffic. So we've been thinking about that with these installations and also with Folly, the residency program. Whenever we install work outside, kind of thinking about the volume and the public that is right there and is definitely observing. And it'll be interesting to see how people kind of slow down sometimes and peer out their windows looking at the work we've put up. So each of these lamps is burning oil, but also has a piece of coal inside, which is about as abundant here as the walnuts and the vultures. You can find it just in the ground or by the railway tracks, which are just maybe a couple miles from our house. So the trains go by where they've left the last working coal mine in Southeast Ohio, and it's kind of spilling off the cars as it goes over a bridge. So together making this piece, we were kind of jointly thinking about what it means to care for a space, what it is as a dividing line, this fence. And in terms of that care, what elements of it might feel gendered, what elements of care are productive versus destructive. And we've just about reached the second intermission, which means it's time for more vultures. They don't just live at my house, they also roost on several of the university buildings, you'll see up there, including this one that houses our Museum of Art and our graduate studios. There are also many cats. So our second intermission is a poem called Vultures. Hung there in the thermal whiteout of noon, dark ash in the chimney's updraft, turning slowly, like a thumb pressed down on target, indolent V's, flies until they drop. Then they're hyenas, raucous around the kill, flapping their black umbrellas, the feathered, red-eyed widows whose pot bodies violate mourning, the snigger at funerals, the burp at the wake. They cluster like beetles laying their eggs on carrion, gluttonous for a space, a little territory of murder, food and children. Frowsy old saint, bald-headed and musty, scrawny-necked recluse on your pillar of blazing air, which is not heaven. What do you make of death, which you do not cause, which you eat daily? I make life, which is prayer. I make clean bones. I make a gray zinc noise, which to me is a song. Well, heart, out of all this carnage, could you do better? And this is the last part of the story. So I mentioned on Wednesday of this week, there was an opening for this exhibition, and that in itself, I think, feels like something notable in this time. We are coming out of the pandemic somewhat. We didn't have to worry about density, even in this small space. You'll see we're still wearing masks, though the university did just relax its mask policy. They're no longer required in some spaces. I think everyone is still sort of getting used to how that might feel and navigating comfort levels. So maybe one set of challenges is resolving itself, but I am still finding ways to integrate my artistic practice with my parenting practice. And that's a major reason why we're meeting right now at 3 instead of at 6, and why exhibition openings often feel kind of impossible. So I wanted to rethink this event so that it could really address that and work with the Vulture Project and the challenges that it addressed rather than against it. And so it became Maura's opening too, and she invited her friends, and we talked about the work on display in ways that made sense to them. So they got to respond to the works in their own way. And here they're using air dry clay to make their own thumbnails, just like it says. And I hung up some of their sketches along with Justin's. We'll take a bit of a tour through the top of the exhibition. Oops. Yeah. This is, so we're looking out the window in this image. It's a little hard to make sense of, but after thinking about Heather Brand's work, we made tracings on the office windows of what we could see outside. So thinking about these layers and like what's tangible and material in front of us and what's behind. This is the new version of the installation of the thumbnails with some pieces, as you'll see below the original installation. And here are some close-ups. We've got on the top left a piece made by Mira, age 5. There are 2 that are kind of swirly earth colors. Those are made by Iris, age 1. Top right is Nora, age 4. And then these 2 yellow ones on the bottom are by Jude, age 6. I think that they got really, really into this integration of like some sort of odds and ends that I had lying around into the play. Also thinking about letting the exhibition be fluid and a little less precious. So they were able to hang these on the wall, and you also here see Iris curating some of the pieces herself in her own way. So I think, you know, thinking about how the drawing practice can sort of become another making practice, I'm also really interested to see how the integration of those practices can become an exhibition practice and can become a life practice, and how to not feel divided and separated. There's a group in Chicago called Extended Practice, which has been organizing exhibitions along these lines for a few years now, where, you know, they might be at different times of day. There are ways that that they can be more accessible to artists who are also parents, and just to folks who don't necessarily have a ton of free time on the same schedule that we tend to schedule these things. And finally, here's our last vulture. Thank you to Margaret Atwood, Donna Haraway, Mora, and Cora Atratus.
Thanks, Kate. We have time for some comments or questions. Please don't hesitate to jump in and contribute to this dialogue, or if you prefer to submit it via chat, that's fine too. We can read it there as well. But if you have any questions or comments, please share. Edward, I see your hands up. Go for it, Edward.
Kate, I just have a comment. So beautiful the way you have presented your talk, the mix of the poetry, the mix of the images, the inclusion of your children, everything gives a shift to the idea of what an artist can be, and it's so wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing and for creating this new version of the exhibition.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I mean, I think it's something that it sort of came from necessity, but the idea that it can be positive and not just a challenge is a really nice way to move forward.
Yeah, I also, yeah, I can echo what Edward said as well, and I'm thinking about how, I mean, really, it just makes me giddy thinking about how the conference has transformed and continues to evolve, and now it's like you said, it started last April, basically. Oh my God, it is becoming drawn out in a way. But I start thinking about the contributions that are happening and the work of the kids, and not so much to put you on the spot. I guess it's something we could think about as kind of like a collective or as a group. But if those contributions from the kids, if they sort of continue on to the next round of showing, or is that sort of considered part of the conference now? But we can talk about that later, or
yeah, I know Jude wants his sculptures back, definitely. But I think there's one installation left. So if he got them a little bit later, I think that would be fine. I certainly think of them as part of the exhibition. But yeah, maybe it's something for everyone to kind of think on and see if we want to include it.
Jenny has their hand raised, and also go back to Edward afterwards.
Hi, Kate. First, this was really great to actually see your work, and I can't believe I haven't been out to your place. I think it was like a weird pandemic thing to see it. But one of the things I'm really interested in is the way in which a kind of performative practice like yours was really transformed by the pandemic, and in your case, the pandemic and maternity at the same time. And I'm wondering if you will see yourself going back to more of the deep dive into the issues around which your work is made, and also these large, sort of very labor-intensive fabric objects, or these kinds of more ephemeral works that speak to a lot more than simply vultures or working with your child. There's a lot of layers there that I think were raised by the isolation of the pandemic. So that's my drawn out question.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I look back on it and it's hard to know what was pandemic and what was maternity. Like you said, they were so related for me. I don't know. I mean, I guess I want to return to my way of working because it sort of feels like an artistic home in a way. But I also know there have been other times in my life when I've been, nomadic more so than now, when I had to work in a different way. And it wasn't about pandemic or children, or, so I think there are ways that my practice, and probably most practices, adapt to whatever the circumstances are. So, I mean, I hope that in a few years, I can sneak out to my studio a little bit more and my children won't even notice that I'm gone. Eventually that'll make me sad, probably. But, it also, I think, is worth asking if it needs to be like that. And I think I have found new value in this way of working that I don't want to let go of necessarily. So I mean, I don't have a full answer maybe, but like it comes and goes as it can.
I have another question kind of going off of that. I found it, first of all, I loved your talk. You're so well spoken, and that was really interesting to listen to. Second of all, I found it really interesting that during this time in the pandemic was when your process really transformed. And I remember like looking back at May of 2020 and that summer, there were so many like instances happening across the globe where like we really woke up to police brutality and facing that all the time, and George Floyd specifically. So was that kind of a moment where it was really hard to not be able to go back to the practice that you had been with for so long, when there was such a time of transformation across the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always paying attention to what feels like injustice, and like I'm reading the news and like concerning myself with those issues of like state violence and police brutality. I think, in that moment, in that summer, again, thinking about pandemic and maternity, it wasn't a place where I felt like my work had something to say. That for me, I had this other thing I had to get out and say. And I don't know, I mean, I guess it's something that also, like, in terms of the sort of specific instances you're talking about, like something that I think about often with my students is like, who is best positioned to tell what stories? And while I was in Chicago, and I didn't mention, but while I was making that work about like the correctional system, I was also like doing work in a Chicago jail. And I had like a personal experience that was part of going into that work. And I think partly being in a rural place, in my house in the pandemic, I didn't feel like I had that experience. That as much as I was sort of watching it unfold, it wasn't something that my work could specifically talk about, if that makes sense. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that totally answers your question, but like sometimes it's all about current events, and sometimes it's really about like the lived experience of mortality. And for me, that was what was going on right then. Oh, Edward Victor, you're saying in the chat, the residency in motherhood, I've heard about that. Yeah. It's like you sort of sign up and participate in a residency from your home or from wherever you are. And I guess I'm also interested in sort of expanding from motherhood to think about parenthood as well, because, you know, in my family, and I think in many other families, like there's an experience specifically of maternity and motherhood, but also just of living with children and of tending to children that isn't necessarily gendered. Jenny, did you have another question, comment?
Yes, I did. So I know Lenka Clayton. I've been on some panels with her, and I'm pretty familiar with her work. And what you did, I would really say, is just completely different. Lenka's work is really funny. And it's the residency in motherhood is all about getting interrupted, not being able to do anything. Courtney knows Lenka too, really well. If you're talking to someone else, Courtney, but anyway, to me, this feels really, really different. It's like an incredibly poetic dive into motherhood, which is deeply engaged. In some ways, it's conceptual. I mean, I would classify Lenka as a conceptual artist. But in other ways, it kind of taps on this feeling that I've been getting from a lot of pandemic art, which is like incredibly poignant and at the same time a little bit lonely, but also this was what you could do with your daughter at this time. And she's not interrupting you. At 2 years old, she's helping you. Like Lenka's 2-year-old was eating a bead. And, you know, I think that became the subject of an artwork. And then she has these really funny videos where she sees how long she can last before, you know, he would disappear around the corner over the street. So I just wanted to add that. And Lenka is a fantastic artist too. So.
Yeah, I think many of my projects would have dealt with that. Just like, how long can I possibly work before like someone is eating something or stepping in something, or like falling off something unstable, and that was what worked. And I don't think I devised the idea of drawing the vultures every day strictly because I knew I could do it with Maura, but it worked because we could do it together, because she was excited about it. Like she would point them out to me and be like, we have to go draw them right now. And it was short and engaging for us both, and it felt productive. So yeah, I think we found something that worked, because there is that other version.
I want to say something that I want to acknowledge at the very beginning, that might sound very similar to what I said previously. It's just that I'm keep on thinking on the achievements of what you did. So this version of the project feels more multidisciplinary. The integration of your research in terms of the poetry that you have presented, the integration of this little person who is not trained to be an artist. So it's being fluent, it's being honest about the approach, and then also becomes a collaboration, because not only are you working together, but decided to fix or add to your own work because it sees it and there's something here missing. So let me add something to this. And then the source material is outside of necessarily of art. This is we're dealing now with biology and seeing the way these animals behave, and then bringing that from that place or that discipline into this other discipline. So what I'm trying to say here is that this presentation is more broad, more multidisciplinary.
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting way to think about it. And like, even as you just said, sort of bringing in biology and ecology, I will say, like, finding ways that work and systems that work. The way I framed it and the way I do frame it is like, we would draw the vultures every day. But that can't be true because they're only there sometimes. Like, they leave when they choose to, based on the temperature and based on the snow and, you know, based on all kinds of reasons that I cannot control. So there are periods of the year when we can draw them every day. And then they would be gone for a week and they would return. And, you know, so even that, like, I had to kind of adapt, you know, the rule-based system that I set up for myself on a human scale had to sort of relax and adapt to the ecological scale.
And the work that you made, I mean, about the subject were the buzzards, and it still comes back to those ideas of social justice that were happening in your work earlier. I mean, you talk about, you know, mentioning the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, and the idea that the birds are one of the few birds that are thriving in this area despite, you know, the Anthropocene and those sort of notions. So it sort of like still is in the work without maybe being so direct with your other work. I mean, not explicit, but it's kind of like hidden in a way, a little bit invisible.
I hope so. I feel like it's one of those things, like, you kind of do something and you see where it lands. And I think I'm pulling those things together as I look back on it and understand what I was doing. Because yeah, I mean, definitely, like, climate is a part of it. Ecology is a part of it. This species is thriving, but certainly in Europe and in India, vultures there are almost extinct due to human contact. So they're not all doing well right now. And it's another form, I think, of like violence and power.
Any last questions or comments?
How did your kid, so I guess I think of children as like very full of life, and judging by your topic was like surrounding a little bit of like death. How did your child kind of deal with the intersection of that? Like, being that they, at those ages, you don't necessarily have a very like accurate conception of death. And I mean, like, your description to the child obviously impacts the way they might relate to those birds and relate to death. So I was just wondering how you dealt with the intersection of that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it did require some sort of frank conversations where you have to like break down, you know, what is our like culturally perceived notion of vultures, and like why do I think they're bad, right? When we call someone a vulture, like, why is that a bad thing? So she was 2 when it started, and she's now 4. So that's kind of a vastly different person. But I have been frank with her about death for the most part. We also experienced family loss during that time, so she had to kind of understand that in both an abstract and a concrete way. But yeah, certainly, like, kids and animals and like which animals eat other animals, it's so fluid depending on who the protagonist is, right? Like, if you're watching animal documentaries and like the wolf is eating a rabbit and it shows you the wolf taking the rabbit back to the wolf cubs, you're like, yeah, feed those babies. But when it shows you the rabbit running away from the wolf, you're like, oh my God, the wolf is terrible. So she's experienced both of those things. I think like it's pretty normal depending on which animal we're paying attention to. So when we have talked about the vultures and what they eat, like, you know, we can see from the window that they're eating roadkill. So we can talk about how like they're eating an animal, like they didn't kill the animal, but the animal died. And now they're eating it. And so she'll call it like old meat that they're eating. And I don't know, it didn't bother her. And I think that was one of the ways that I sort of found an into the project, that like that fact of these animals really bothering me, but not her, made me think about it. And then also made me think about like, you know, I have done all this research into executions and like terrorist groups and like, why do vultures bother me? But yeah, like, what does it mean I think it's because I'm projecting myself into that, like death and rot, and she's not yet doing that. So I think that's kind of the difference. Like she understands that she's alive and that being alive means that you die, but hasn't really confronted the personal nature of that. And yeah, if we see a hawk with a mouse, like sometimes she's upset, sometimes she's not. And it depends on who the protagonist is, really. And I think that's what this project did. Like for me, it sort of shifted the vultures from being an antagonist to being a protagonist in the story, right? So I like look out and see them and like I feel like I know them. So it doesn't bother me.
I also really enjoyed your reframing of the human experience as being discovered rather than discovering things. I think we often oversell ourselves into thinking we're a lot better than we are. So.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Anybody else? Questions, comments? All right. Kate, thank you so much again for your addition here. It was really insightful and great to get to know you and your work more, and definitely will sort of create a rippling effect for us and the conference participants. And furthermore, everybody in the audience, you can catch you can catch archived previous versions of the Drawn Out Conference online, drawnoutconference.com. It'll be archived there for I don't know when. It's on Denison University's sort of Google Drive. Hope to see you next month with Professor Justin Coleman at the last round of the Drawn Out Conference, April 5th. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.